I've spent my life building things. A business, a reputation, a family. But there's one thing I never managed to build: patience for people who think they're entitled to something they didn't earn. Especially a man who sits in your chair, drinks your bourbon, and talks about your property like it already belongs to him. That man was Harold Bennett. And before I tell you how I dealt with Harold, I need to take you back to the exact afternoon when everything started. My name is Andrew Martin. I'm 69 years old. I was born and raised in Fort Collins, Colorado, and I've spent most of my life there. I have one son, Daniel Martin, 31 years old. Smart kid, kind-hearted, hard-working. If I ever did anything truly right in my life, it was raising him. I also own a second property, a beautiful 4-bedroom craftsman-style house on Mariana Butte Drive in Loveland, Colorado. I bought that place 12 years ago. The house sits on a gentle hill overlooking the reservoir. Every evening, the sunlight reflects off the water and turns the whole view into something special. Recently, I decided it was time to rent it out. The market in Loveland was strong, and my property manager, Jane Holt, had already found a couple of promising applicants. Jane had spent over 20 years in Colorado real estate. She didn't waste words. She didn't play games. And when she recommended a tenant, I trusted her judgment. All I needed to do was make one final visit to the house, take a few updated photos, and give Jane approval to move forward. Simple. Or at least that's what I thought. That Thursday afternoon was beautiful. Clear skies, warm August air, the kind of weather Colorado is famous for. The drive from Fort Collins to Loveland takes about 45 minutes, and I'd made it hundreds of times before. The radio was playing softly. The windows were down. I was thinking about rental prices and whether the master bedroom needed a fresh coat of paint before the next tenants moved in. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious, just another ordinary day. At exactly 2:14 in the afternoon, I turned onto Mariana Butte Drive. Everything looked normal. Children were riding bicycles. The neighborhood was quiet. Trees cast long shadows across the street. Then I pulled into my driveway, and my stomach tightened. 3 vehicles were parked there. None of them belonged to me. A Chevy Silverado, a white GMC Yukon, and a silver Honda Accord with a damaged tail light. My garage door was wide open, and music was playing inside the house. Not loud music, not party music, just comfortable music, the kind of music people play when they feel completely at home. I sat in my truck for several seconds. I didn't move. I simply stared. Something wasn't right. Then I recognized the Silverado. It belonged to Harold Bennett, my daughter-in-law Cassie's father. I'd seen that truck once before at Daniel and Cassie's house. Suddenly, every warning bell in my head started ringing. I got out of the truck, walked to the front door, and stepped inside. The moment I entered, I stopped. There were 6 people in my house. 6. Not guests waiting for permission. Not visitors stopping by. These people were settled in, comfortable, like they owned the place. Harold Bennett was sitting in my favorite chair near the window. My chair, one leg crossed casually over the other, looking completely relaxed. His wife, Maureen Bennett, was stretched out on my couch, shoes off, comfortable as could be. Their son Kyle sat nearby scrolling through his phone. His girlfriend Trish was laughing beside him. And standing in my kitchen were 2 complete strangers I'd never met before. A man wearing a University of Kansas hoodie, and a woman walking barefoot across my hardwood floors. My hardwood floors. There was food spread across the kitchen island. Someone had put together an expensive charcuterie board, like they were enjoying a weekend getaway. Then my eyes landed on the kitchen counter, and that's when my patience disappeared. My bottle of Blanton's single-barrel bourbon sat there, opened, half empty, a bottle I'd been saving since 2019, a bottle reserved for a special occasion. Apparently, Harold had decided that occasion belonged to him. He noticed me first, and what happened next honestly shocked me, because he didn't look embarrassed. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look surprised. Instead, he smiled, a big, confident smile. "Andrew," he said cheerfully, "we were wondering when you'd get here." The room went silent. Everyone looked at me. I looked back at them. Then I spoke. "Harold." My voice stayed calm. "What exactly is going on here?" Harold laughed. Actually laughed. then waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, relax," he said. "Cassie told us it was fine." Fine. The word echoed in my head. Fine. As if that explained everything. As if permission from my daughter-in-law somehow overruled ownership. "We needed a place for family to stay," Harold continued. He gestured around the room proudly. "Great house, by the way." I stared at him. Then Maureen spoke up from the couch. "It'll belong to Daniel eventually anyway." She said it casually, like she was discussing tomorrow's weather. Then came the moment I'll never forget. Harold laughed again. A real laugh. The kind that comes from genuine confidence. And suddenly I understood something. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't poor judgment. This wasn't an innocent mistake. These people had already decided in their minds that my property was part of their future. They weren't acting like visitors. They were acting like future owners. Kyle chuckled. Trish laughed. The stranger in the Kansas hoodie even raised a glass of my bourbon toward me. Like we were celebrating together. I let them finish. Every laugh. Every smile. Every ounce of disrespect. Then I walked farther into the room. Slowly. Calmly. No yelling. No threats. No anger. Just certainty. I stopped in the center of the living room. Looked at each face carefully. Then I spoke. "I'm only going to say this one time." The room became very quiet. "This is my house." I paused. "My name is on the deed." Another pause. "I don't care what Cassie told you. I don't care what assumptions you've made. Every person in this room and every vehicle in my driveway needs to be gone before I come back." Nobody spoke. Not Harold. Not Maureen. Not Kyle. Nobody. I looked directly at Harold. Then I turned toward the door. Before leaving, I stopped one last time. "Oh, and Harold?" He looked up. "Replace the bourbon." Then I walked out, closed the door behind me, and left. Most people would think that's where the story ends. It wasn't. That wasn't revenge. That wasn't even the beginning. That was simply me setting the stage. The real plan hadn't started yet. I got back into my truck, drove several blocks away, and pulled into a Starbucks parking lot. For a few minutes, I sat there staring through the windshield. Then I called Daniel. He answered immediately. "Hey, Dad. Everything okay?" "No," I said, "but I need you to answer a question first." His voice changed instantly. "Okay. Did you give Cassie a key to the Loveland house?" There was silence. Several seconds of silence. Then he answered, "Yeah." His voice sounded uncertain now. "A few months ago. She said she wanted to check on the place occasionally." I closed my eyes. "Did you tell her she could give that key to anyone else?" "Of course not." Now he sounded worried. "Dad, what's happening?" So I told him. Everything. Harold. The house. The strangers. The bourbon. All of it. When I finished, Daniel didn't speak immediately. Finally, he said quietly, "Cassie never told me." "I know. I'm sorry, Dad." The thing is, Daniel wasn't apologizing because he had done something wrong. He was apologizing because he was a decent man. A good son. The kind of person who feels responsible when people he loves make bad choices. "You didn't do this," I told him. "You trusted your wife." Another pause. Then he asked the question, "What are you going to do?" I looked out across the parking lot. The afternoon sun was beginning to lower, and in that moment, my anger had already transformed into something else. Something colder. Something more focused. "I'm going to handle it." Then I ended the call. A few seconds later, I made another one. This time to Bill Tanner, my attorney for 19 years. Bill knew me well. Well enough that he skipped the small talk entirely. I explained everything from beginning to end. Every detail. Every face. Every word. When I finished speaking, the line went silent. I could almost hear him thinking, analyzing, building possibilities. Then he finally spoke, and what he said next would become the first step in a plan that Harold Bennett never saw coming. A plan that would take patience. A plan that would take time. And a plan that would eventually teach Harold exactly what happens when you mistake someone's kindness for weakness. Bill Tanner stayed quiet for several seconds after I finished telling him everything. That wasn't unusual. Bill never rushed into a response. For nearly 19 years, I'd watched him handle complicated situations the same way. He listened first. He thought second. Then he acted. Finally, he spoke. Andrew, did anyone threaten you? No. Damage the property? Not that I saw. Did you ask them to leave? I did. And they left. Another pause. Then Bill said something that immediately caught my attention. Good. That gives us options. I leaned back in the driver's seat. What kind of options? The kind that require patience. I smiled slightly. Patience wasn't a problem. At that moment, I had plenty of it. What I didn't have was any intention of forgetting what happened inside my house. Bill and I spoke for almost an hour. By the time we finished, the first pieces of a larger plan were already falling into place. The next morning, I called Jane Holt. Need you to hold off on showing the property for a week. She didn't ask questions. Didn't argue. Didn't push. Understood, she said. That was why I liked working with Jane. When something needed to be done, she simply did it. For the next several days, life looked completely normal, at least from the outside. I went about my routine, met friends for coffee, handled a few business matters, worked in the yard, spent time with Daniel. Anyone watching would have assumed the situation was over, but behind the scenes, Bill was building a file, a very detailed file, and every day, that file grew larger. 6 days after finding the Bennetts in my house, I had dinner with Daniel and Cassie. The evening felt ordinary. Daniel talked about a major project at work. Cassie spoke about her sister's new baby. We ate. We laughed. We discussed everyday things. For most of the meal, nobody mentioned the Loveland property. Then, halfway through dessert, Cassie casually brought it up. My parents stopped by the Loveland house recently. The comment seemed casual, but her eyes were watching me carefully, waiting, looking for a reaction. I gave her none. Oh, I said, how'd they like it? They loved it. I nodded. Beautiful area. It really is. For a second, she looked almost disappointed, like she expected a different response. But there wasn't one. I reached for another dinner roll and changed the subject. The conversation moved on. What Cassie didn't know was that Bill Tanner had already started preparing paperwork. Serious paperwork. The kind that leaves a paper trail. The kind that becomes important later. For days after that dinner, Bill called again. The moment I answered, I knew something had happened. His voice had that tone. The one lawyers use when a situation suddenly becomes bigger than expected. Jane stopped by the property, he said. Routine inspection. Yes. I waited. There was mail. That got my attention. What kind of mail? Bill exhaled slowly. A magazine subscription. I stayed quiet. A piece of insurance correspondence. Still listening. And a Costco membership renewal. Now I understood. All addressed to Harold and Maureen Bennett. At my property. At my address. I stared out the window. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the obvious question. How long do you think they've been using that address? Long enough to receive renewal notices. The answer irritated me more than finding them in the house, because it revealed something important. This hadn't been a spontaneous visit. This hadn't been a family gathering. This had been planned, thought out, prepared. People don't accidentally redirect mail. People don't accidentally establish an address. That takes intention. Bill reached the same conclusion. Andrew, when you described that afternoon, I thought they were acting comfortable. They were. Now I think they were acting familiar. I knew exactly what he meant. Those weren't people borrowing space. Those were people behaving as if they already belonged there. And that changed everything. Build the file, I said. Already doing it. Within days, several things happened. First, a formal trespassing report was filed with the Larimer County Sheriff's Office. No drama. No public accusations. No emotional confrontations. Just facts. Date, time, location, names, everything documented. Then certified letters were prepared. One addressed to Harold Bennett. One addressed to Maureen Bennett. Both delivered directly to their home in Wichita, Kansas. The letters were simple, professional, clear. They stated that the Mariana Butte Drive property was privately owned, that they had entered without authorization, and that any future entry without written permission would be considered criminal trespass. No threats, no arguments, just legal reality. I never called Harold. Never warned him. Never discussed it with Cassie. Never mentioned it to Daniel. The letters simply arrived. And once they arrived, the record existed forever. Sometimes the strongest move is the quietest one. A week later, Jane informed me she had narrowed the rental applications down to 2 excellent candidates. Her favorite was a young couple named Ryan and Beth Hudson. Good credit, strong employment history, excellent references. Jane said something else that stood out. They sent a handwritten thank you note. That may not sound like much, but these days, people rarely take the time. It told me something about their character. I approved the application immediately. The lease was signed at $2,850 per month. Move-in date, September 1st. Problem solved, at least on the surface. That evening I sat alone on the back patio of my Fort Collins home. The sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains. The sky shifted from gold to orange to deep blue. And I made myself a promise. Daniel would not suffer because of this. No matter what happened, no matter what decisions I made, no matter how frustrated I became with Cassie or her family, Daniel would never become collateral damage. He was my son, and protecting him mattered more than any revenge. The months passed. Then more months. Life moved forward. Ryan and Beth settled into the Loveland property. Every rent payment arrived on time. The house was cared for. The garden looked better than ever. Everything seemed peaceful. But some lessons take time, and some plans need room to grow. 14 months passed. Then one Tuesday morning at exactly 8 a.m., I picked up the phone and called Bill Tanner. He answered immediately. "I've been expecting this call." I laughed. "Have you?" "You've been thinking." "I have. And whenever you call after thinking for 14 months, it usually means something significant." He wasn't wrong. I looked across my kitchen table. A folder sat there. Inside were notes, ideas, plans, questions, and one decision. I want to sell the house. Silence. Not shock. Just calculation. Bill considering the implications. The Loveland property? Yes. Completely. Completely. Another pause. That's a valuable asset, Andrew. The asset isn't the house. He waited. The asset is what comes next. Now I had his full attention. I explained everything. Every detail. Every concern. Every reason. Most importantly, I explained the lesson I wanted preserved long after I was gone. When I finished speaking, Bill remained silent for several seconds. Then he said something I'll never forget. "That is the most thorough estate strategy you've ever proposed." "Can it be done?" "Oh, it can be done." A small smile crossed my face. "Good." For the next 2 weeks, Bill built something extraordinary. Something precise. Something carefully designed. And something Harold Bennett would never see coming. The first step happened quickly. Jane listed the Loveland property. Professional photographs. Strong pricing. Excellent marketing. Within 9 days, 3 serious offers arrived. I selected the cleanest one. A couple from Denver. Solid financing. No complications. Fast closing. 30 days later, the sale was complete. The house was gone. Just like that. The property Harold Bennett had mentally included in his future no longer belonged to me. It belonged to strangers. No arguments. No announcement. No warning. One signature after another. And it was over. But the sale itself wasn't the real move. It was merely the foundation. The real move involved where the money went next. And when Bill showed me the final trust documents, I knew the next chapter of this story was about to begin. Because every assumption Harold Bennett had made about inheritance, access, and future ownership was about to collide with a legal structure unlike anything he could have imagined. And that collision was going to change everything. The morning Bill Tanner brought me the final trust documents, I already knew one thing. This wasn't about money anymore. Money had simply become the tool. The real issue was respect. The lack of it. The assumption that because I was getting older, people could start counting my assets before I was even gone. The belief that what I built would eventually become available to anyone bold enough to claim a piece of it. That belief had started in my living room the day Harold Bennett sat in my chair and laughed. Now it was time to make sure that laugh cost him. Bill arrived carrying a thick folder. He placed it on my dining room table and sat down. "Before we start," he said, "I want to be absolutely clear about something." I nodded. This structure is legal. Good. It's enforceable. Better. And it's probably the most detailed trust I've drafted in years. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. Bill opened the folder. Page after page of documents. Every sentence carefully written. Every clause reviewed multiple times. Every possibility considered. This wasn't something thrown together in an afternoon. It was a fortress built out of paperwork. And fortresses exist for a reason. Walk me through it, I said. Bill nodded. The first part is straightforward. Daniel remained the primary beneficiary, exactly as I'd always intended. Nothing changed there. Not for a second. I never considered cutting my son out. Never considered punishing him. Never considered making him pay for someone else's actions. Daniel had done nothing wrong. He remained the center of everything. Bill continued. When the time comes, Daniel receives full inheritance rights. I nodded. Good. That mattered. Then Bill turned another page. This is where things become more specific. I leaned forward. The next section contained a clause unlike anything Harold Bennett would expect. Any trust assets intended for Daniel would remain protected unless a specific legal condition was satisfied. That condition involved Cassie. If she wished to obtain any legal claim, benefit, ownership interest, access rights, or financial participation connected to those trust assets, a postnuptial agreement would first be required. Not optional. Required. Prepared by independent legal counsel. Reviewed separately. Signed voluntarily. Fully documented. No shortcuts. No assumptions. No loopholes. Bill looked up. That's the core protection. I smiled, because I understood exactly what it meant. Nobody could simply drift into ownership. Nobody could casually assume future access. Nobody could treat inheritance as community property by default. Structure now existed where assumptions once lived. And assumptions were exactly what had created this problem. The trust went even further. Bill had established a completely separate legacy fund. This fund had one purpose: future grandchildren. Nothing else. The money inside that fund could only be used for education, healthcare, housing assistance, and future opportunities directly benefiting my grandchildren. Not their parents. Not extended relatives. Not in-laws. Not anyone who happened to believe they deserved a piece. Only the grandchildren. Every dollar protected. Every distribution monitored. Every condition documented. As Bill explained the details, I found myself thinking back to that afternoon in Loveland. The charcuterie board. The open bourbon. The laughter. The confidence. What struck me now was how certain Harold had been. He never asked permission because he believed permission wasn't necessary. In his mind, the future had already been decided. The problem was that he had built his future using somebody else's property. And foundations like that eventually collapse. When the meeting ended, I signed the documents. One signature. Then another. Then another. Several witnesses completed their portions. The trust became official. Finished. Enforceable. Permanent. I felt something afterward. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Relief. Because the uncertainty was gone. For the first time since that afternoon, I knew exactly where everything stood. The next year passed quietly. No confrontations. No angry phone calls. No family arguments. Life simply continued. Daniel advanced at work. Cassie remained polite during family gatherings. Birthdays came and went. Holidays arrived and passed. Everything appeared normal. But underneath that normal surface, tension slowly built. Because eventually, secrets have a way of finding daylight. The discovery happened nearly 18 months after I first found the Bennetts inside my house. Ironically, it wasn't me who revealed anything. It was Bill. Or more specifically, a conversation Bill had with Daniel, at my request. By then, Daniel needed to understand certain aspects of the estate planning. Nothing alarming. Nothing urgent. Just responsible preparation. Bill invited him to the office. They reviewed documents, discussed responsibilities, answered questions, and eventually Daniel asked about the trust protections. A reasonable question. An important question. One that deserved an honest answer. According to Bill, Daniel listened carefully. Read every page. Asked intelligent questions. Then sat quietly for several minutes. Finally, he looked up. Was this because of Loveland? Bill didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked a question of his own. Do you remember what happened there? Daniel apparently laughed once. Not because it was funny. Because it wasn't. It was the laugh people make when remembering something embarrassing. Yeah, he said. I remember. Bill nodded. Then you already know the answer. Daniel didn't argue, didn't complain, didn't become angry. And that told me everything I needed to know. Because deep down, he understood. Several weeks later, Cassie learned about the trust. I wasn't present for that conversation, but I heard about it afterward. Apparently, it began with confusion, then surprise, then frustration. Questions followed. Lots of them. Why was the trust structured this way? Why were there extra protections? Why was a post-nuptial agreement required? Why so many conditions? The answer was simple. Because actions have consequences. Sometimes immediate, sometimes delayed. But consequences arrive eventually. What surprised me most wasn't Cassie's reaction. It was Harold's. Because somehow the information found its way to Wichita. And when it did, Harold Bennett was furious. Absolutely furious. Not because he'd lost something. Because he never actually owned anything. Not because property had been taken from him. Because none of it belonged to him in the first place. No, Harold was angry because expectations had been destroyed. And for some people, losing an expectation feels exactly like losing property. He called. Several times. I never answered. He left messages. I never returned them. Eventually a letter arrived. Not from an attorney. From Harold himself. 3 pages. Mostly complaints. Accusations. Suggestions that I was being unfair. Suggestions that I was creating division. Suggestions that family should trust family. That last one made me laugh. Family should trust family. Interesting philosophy. Especially from the man who redirected mail to my property and moved into my house without permission. I placed the letter back into its envelope, then shredded it. Life moved on. Another year passed. Then another. And something remarkable happened. Nothing. No legal challenges. No disputes. No confrontations. Because there was nothing to challenge. Everything had been done properly. Carefully. Legally. The structure held exactly as intended. One evening, several years later, Daniel and I sat together on my back porch. The sun was setting behind the mountains. The same view I'd watched hundreds of times before. We talked about work, family, future plans, normal things. Then Daniel surprised me. You know, he said, staring out toward the horizon. I was angry for a while. I looked at him. About the trust? He nodded. At first. I stayed quiet. Then he smiled slightly. But after a while, I understood. I waited. He took a sip of coffee. You weren't protecting money. No, he shook his head. You were protecting boundaries. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I smiled, because he had finally said exactly what I'd been trying to explain all along. This was never about wealth, never about inheritance, never even about Harold Bennett. It was about boundaries. The moment people stop respecting boundaries, they start believing they deserve access. Access becomes expectation. Expectation becomes entitlement. And entitlement eventually becomes conflict. The Loveland house taught me that. Harold Bennett taught me that. And fortunately, I learned the lesson before it was too late. The last time I ever heard Harold's name was during a brief conversation with Daniel. Apparently, he had complained again about the trust, complained about the sale of the house, complained about opportunities that never existed. Daniel listened, then finally told him something that ended the discussion. It was never yours. Simple, direct, accurate, and according to Daniel, Harold had no response. Because what argument can a person make against the truth? The truth was simple. I built the company. I bought the property. I paid the taxes. I carried the responsibility. And when the time came, I protected what I built. Not through anger, not through shouting, not through revenge, through planning, through patience, through decisions. And in the end, that proved stronger than any argument ever could. The funny thing is, people often imagine revenge as something dramatic. A confrontation, a screaming match, a public humiliation. But the most effective revenge is often much quieter. It's watching someone realize that the future they already spent in their imagination was never available to them at all. And by the time Harold Bennett finally understood that lesson, every door he thought was open had already been locked. Legally, permanently, and forever.